my name is London. I am the Associate Director for the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. I'm here on behalf of our director, Twina Tardif, and Twina's car broke down on the road, so she couldn't be here at this moment. So I will introduce our speaker today, and I would also like to make a couple of announcements, and for several upcoming events we are hosting. So first, we wish to welcome you to the 8th presentation in our virtual noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for 2020. And the complete series schedule is available on our center's website, and you have email reminders sent out weekly. So I think many of you are getting our emails. And a couple of announcements on the upcoming events. So our next presentation in the LRCCS noon lecture series will take place on Tuesday, November 17th, so next week. And that will be given by Wen Yu, LRCCS postdoctoral fellow, and who will be speaking on constructing a China, nationalism and culture in modern history. And so that's the next week's event. And this evening, the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, in partnership with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, will present a live-streamed National Committee presentation by Ray Daniel, the renowned investor and New York Times best-selling author. And that will be followed by a LRCCS webinar panel discussion by several UM faculty. So I want to remind everyone that if you're interested in participating in these events, you have to first register, for the talk by Ray Daniel at the website of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and then register separately for our discussion, our community discussion. And the concurrent event will begin at 7 p.m. tonight. So the talk by Ray Daniel will begin at 7 p.m. and then our community conversation discussion will happen from 8 to 9 p.m. And you can find more information on this from our center's website. Okay, so with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. So today's presentation will be given by Zhou, Assistant Professor of Sociology and Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. So Yun's research examines social inequality and state market family relations through the lens of gender, marriage, and reproduction. Her work combines statistical analysis of survey data, in-depth interviews, and agent-based computational models. With a focus on gender equity and authoritarian reproductive governance, Dr. Zhou's current project investigates the intended and unintended consequences of China's recent shift toward a universal two-child policy. So today, Dr. Zhou will be speaking on the gendered pursuit of individualism, fertility intention, and the meaning of children in contemporary urban China. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Zhou.
I'm gonna share my screen. Please bear with me for one moment. Okay, all right. Thank you for the kind introduction, and hello everybody. Thank you all for being here. I hope you had a relaxing weekend, and I hope you and your loved ones are doing well in these challenging times. So today's talk is part of my larger and ongoing project that looks at China's recent ending of the one-child policy. The overarching goal of the project is to intersect social demography with culture, politics, and law in trying to understand how, on the one hand, the state exerts control over individuals through population and reproductive policies, and on the other hand, how individuals understand their selfhood and individual rights in a context where the state has considerable power over them. So today's talk looks at gender, selfhood, and the meaning of children. So let's get started. Remarkable changes in family life have taken place across the globe over the past several decades. We see a decline in marriage, we see a sustained decline in fertility, and we also see the decoupling between marriage and childbearing. Demographers describe these trends collectively as the second demographic transition. The second demographic transitions happened in Western industrialized societies first, and gradually diffused to the rest of the world. And here, as an example, you can see how fertility changed in three areas. The blue line is North America, the green line is Europe, and the red line is East Asia. The decline of fertility to below replacement started first in Europe and North America in the 1960s. And gradually, East Asia has caught up and now joined the rank in becoming the regions which has some of the countries that have the lowest low fertility rates. So looking at these global transformations in family lives, demographers naturally are curious and ask about the question of why. What are some of the determinants that can help us understand this global diffusion of demographic transitions? On a macro level, considerable attention has been devoted to understand the link, to understand and theorize about the link between development and demographic transitions. And when these theories are taken to the micro level, scholars highlight the role of individuals' ideational shift, particularly a growing adherence to individualism as the driver that is underlying the demographic transition we observe. The retreat from fertility, the decline in marriage, and the decoupling between marriage and childbearing. And here, as an example of the two of the most prominent demographic transition theories, for example, Lieberthal, when in his theorization of demographic transition, he emphasized the role of individuals' pursuit of higher order needs. The idea here is that family relations become secondary to individuals' need for self-actualization. And hence, we observe this retreat from marriage and retreat from childbearing. Similarly, Thornton posited a system of beliefs that he calls development idealism, the central to which are the idea of freedom, autonomy, and individualism. And as this in development idealism diffuse across the globe, individuals' growing adherence to individualism increases, and then we see a delayed marriage and we see smaller family size. In these theorizations, gender sometimes remain an overlooked and separate dimension. In the theorization of self-actualizing needs and the retreat from marriage and parenthood, the link is oftentimes theorized as an agender link. The pursuit of higher order needs, the pursuit of self-actualization apply to women and men alike. The needs are the higher, or what higher order needs mean in these frameworks seem applied to both genders in similar and uniform ways. And similarly, individualism is often understood in very broad and sweeping terms. In other words, individualism is understood as this cultural tenet that characterizes entire societies, distinguishing them on the spectrum of modernity. However, we know that fertility decisions are made by people embodying gendered bodies and with gendered life experience. So in this project, I ask, how do women and men make fertility decisions and attach meaning to parenthood and children as they construct visions of self? In doing so, I bring together two traditions of scholarship. On one hand, demographic research that describe and theorize about broad pattern, macro level family changes and patterns. On the other hand, the long tradition in sociology that explores questions that has to do with identity and selfhood. In doing so, I argue that through fertility decision-making, individuals enact gendered assertions of selfhood. Parenthood are these gendered means that individuals rely on to articulate and achieve their visions of a gendered individualism. Particularly for women, transition into parenthood and childbearing is viewed as the breaking of individual self is viewed as the harbinger of the loss of individual autonomy. Whereas for men in contemporary China, having transitioned into parenthood and having children is viewed as the making of individual self. It's viewed as the beginning of your own family, and it's viewed as the beginning of coming to one's own and the beginning of individual autonomy. So this make or break dynamic, this make or break pattern calls us to really gender the link between the pursuit of individualism on one hand and the retreat from parenthood on the other. And to arrive at this picture, to arrive at this point, this is the road we're going to travel together. First, I'm going to set the scene by talking about selfhood in contemporary China. And then I will briefly describe my data and my methods. And then we're going to turn to the findings, the making and the breaking of self. I conclude with some implications, both policy implications and the theoretical implications. So let's get started. How do we imagine our future? And what does that imagination say about our present self? Cultural sociologists employ the concept imagined futures to study questions of identity and selfhood. Imagined future give oneself a design of a self to which we aspire, and is one of the key components of a person's sense of identity. And in this sense, we can understand individuals' fertility aspiration through this concept of imagined futures. And China is a particularly rich context to look into how fertility decision-making serve as this gendered construction of selfhood. Because in this context, what individuals imagine as possible are also deeply constrained by the state's decades-long population and reproductive control policies. So in this sense, in the Chinese context, fertility aspiration and reproduction links the personal and the political. On one hand, it is how individuals aspire and how individuals imagine what their future self and future family is going to look like. But on the other hand, it is also where the state exerts control. Thus, it becomes this interesting locus to examine how gendered state control is both experienced and may also be contexted in the quotidian life. So in this sense, how do individuals in this context, how do individuals attach meaning to children? And before we get to that, let me briefly walk you through the population control and reproductive governance context in contemporary China. Right after 1949, China's large population was initially thought of as a blessing, provided a large labor reservoir. However, managing a largely rural and poor population soon presented its challenges. So all through the 1960s, China saw very sporadic and voluntary birth planning programs with minimal results. The mandatory birth planning program started in 1970s with a later longer fewer campaign, 晚少息. Later refers to later first marriage, longer refers to longer birth interval, and fewer refers to the fewer children per family, the strict two children for urban families and 3 children for rural families. So thus cap. And all through 1970s, China's total fertility rate declined from above 6 at the beginning of the 70s to about 2.7, 2.8 at the end of the decade. So against this backdrop of continued fertility decline, scholars have been asking, then why? Why does the CCP, why does the Communist Party put forward this one-child policy that produced even more draconian and stricter birth limit on families? China's one-child policy came at a time when the state is trying to reclaim and reestablish its legitimacy after Mao Zedong's death and the end of the tumultuous Cultural Revolution. And whereas in the past, revolutionary successes were ways where the state used to claim legitimacy, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, the state turned to economic growth as possibly modernization and economic growth as the possible new basis. And based on deeply flawed and pseudoscientific demographic projections, capping the birth limit at 1 child per family is believed to be able to produce the optimal population size for China's economic development. And in this process, population size becomes a political target. Controlling reproduction and population becomes a way for the states to achieving the state's goal in production and development, on which the new foundations of state legitimacy lie. China's fertility decline keeps on going. And demographers has largely reached the consensus that China has reached below replacement level fertility since the early 1990s, around the 1991, 1992. In other words, China has joined its other East Asian neighbors in having a sustained below replacement fertility level for the past near 3 decades. And it is against this drop in 2016, China's one-child policy was universally repealed, and now it's replaced by the universal two-child policy, allowing all married couples in mainland China to have 2 children. And the population, the goal of the two-child policy comes in a very similar flavor to the one-child policy. It's really to deal with the challenges of China's sustained decline in fertility, shrinking labor pool, diminishing demographic dividend, and rapid population aging. And unlike the previous relaxation to China's one-child policy, which often comes from expert elites and are met with often bitter oppositions and factional debates. After the establishment of the universal two-child policy, the universal two-child policy actually received concerted state promotion. Here is a two-child policy poster, and the state have put forward a host of measures to incentivize second birth. So on the left-hand side, you will see an open letter. This is in Yichang, one of a central city in China. Their city government put forward an official open letter encouraging second birth among CCP members. So CCP members are asked to lead the way in producing two children per family, either by doing it themselves or encouraging their children to do so. And on the right-hand side is an example of numerous media reports that state media have put forward, promoting and encouraging local governments' birth incentivizing efforts. So in other words, the universal two-child policy comes in a very familiar flavor. Again, the policy goal is to deal with the challenges of declining fertility, shrinking labor pool, rapid population. Again, population size is the part of the political calculation for achieving political goals. Here is the goal of development. And in this process, just as the one-child policy, women's bodies are vehicles for achievement of urgent demographic goals. So in other words, against this backdrop, I ask, how do women and men make fertility decisions and attach meaning to parenthood and children as they construct visions of self? Writ large, this is a question of existentially what it means to be autonomous independent, lead a life of one's own, and have individual rights in a context where the state holds considerable power over individuals, and those power often extend into the most private and personal sphere. So to answer these questions, I rely on original in-depth interviews. Original qualitative in-depth interviews are especially well-equipped and well-suited to look at individuals' deeply held belief, ideations, and values. And I have to say, the longer I am a social demographer that use a lot of survey data, the longer I have a deep appreciation for mixed method scholars, for scholars who use qualitative data, archives, ethnography, interviews, and so forth. So I relied, my data come from 115 original in-depth interviews conducted in 2 metropolitan areas in China. And to reach my respondent, I relied on snowball sampling with very strict sample selection criteria. To qualify for the study, one has to, I intentionally recruited both women and men. And to qualify, they have to be between the age of 22 and 38. So currently in the reproductive age span. And they're heterosexual, and they have completed some form of tertiary education. And more importantly, those respondents are not in union with each other. I'm happy to talk more about the data and method in the Q&A. But here, the overarching idea is that I want to have a sample where for a small n, it is still allowing me to have some variability in the data, but also to avoid over-fragmentation. And to recruit, I limited the number of seats each referral can give to me, so that I can read. So there to reduce the risk of clustering in the final sample. Later, I did a cluster analysis on the sample. Clustering wasn't a problem, I stopped interviewing when data saturation is reached, meaning that with each additional interview, no new salient theme was emergent. I intentionally recruited individuals across 3 life stages: those who are never married, those who are in their first marriage but never had children, and those who are in their first marriage and only have 1 child. Here, the idea is that overarchingly, this project, I want to look at individuals both transition into marriage, transition into first birth, and transition into second birth. That's why it's intentionally recruited across 3 life course stages. And you can see roughly there are 70 women, 45 men. Roughly half of the women are never married, half of the women are in their first marriage, about 2/3 of the men are never married, about 1/3 of them are in their first marriage. And among the married individuals, about half and half, or 1/3 to half, are without children, and the other are have their first child. So in the interviews, the interview protocol covered a range of questions. We talked about their transition into marriage, so their dating history, their marriage timing, what are the obstacles and preconditions that need to be in place or be dealt with before they can get married. So, is there a retreat from marriage, or are there conditions and obstacles that are keeping people from actually getting married? And similarly, we talked about individuals transition into childbearing, so their timing, their ideal and intended timing of first or second birth, their fertility ideals and intentions, meaning that ideally, how many children would you like to have and when, or how many children do you intend to have? Do you intend to have your first child in the next 3 years? And what are some of the obstacles that are keeping them from transitioning into parenthood or second birth? And we also talked a lot about those individuals' work life. So what are the job search experience? What are their workplace routines? What are their work family friendly policies in place? If there are, what are the norms about using these policies? We also talked about their family life. So what are their household routines? So who does what kind of housework and why? What are the ideal and sometimes actual division of housework? Do they outsource housework or childcare either to grandparents, their own parents, or nannies, caregivers, or other form of housework outsourcing? And also we talked about the interview protocol also incorporated questions on individuals, specifically explicitly on individuals' gender-related attitudes. So I adapted a series of gender attitude items from the word value survey. And I asked not only whether they agree or disagree with each statement, but I also explored their reasoning for disagree and disagreeing with each statement. And finally, very specifically, I asked about their attitudes toward reproductive control. So I asked not only their attitude about the two-child policy, I also asked about their attitude toward the one-child policy. So taken together, these interview protocols covers a wide range of questions. The goal and they do provide a very holistic picture of how individuals see themselves in relation to family, how individuals experience gender, how individuals enact gender, or how individuals sort of make decisions about marriage reproduction in relation to their role in the public sphere, in relation to wage work and labor market. So the interviews were conducted in from January 2016 to July 2017. They're conducted over the phone and because I was here. But to ensure data quality, I also conducted a few face-to-face interviews. Analysis show there are no difference in data quality, and the length, the detailed, how detailed, and how the flow, the rapport between the phone interviews and the face-to-face interviews. So after I conducted all the interviews myself, and after the data were collected, I repeatedly listened to recordings. I coded the transcriptions, I write analytical memos, and doing so allowed me to identify the key themes inductively in the interviews. So let's get to the findings. Zhou is 31 years old. At the time of the interview, she has been married for 4 years. And at the time, she was very adamant that she does not intend to have children. And when I asked her, why do you not want to have children? Zhou said, I don't really want to have children. I'm worried. Having children is going to be a large, completely transformative impact. I don't know if it's selfish, but I don't want to prioritize my own development over having children. And Zhou's idea about having children being this large transformative impact, she is not alone in thinking that. And also she's not an outlier. About a third of the female respondents who do not yet have children are very adamant that they do not intend to have children. Of course, we can think more about to what extent this desire can actually be realized a few years down the line. But here, the point is, this idea that children is this completely transformative and large impact also comes up in individuals who are actually, among women who are actually very active and are in the process of wanting to have a kid, of preparing for having a kid. So Anling is also 31 years old. She has been married for 2 years at the time of the interview. And she is in the process of trying for children. She told me a lot about how they stopped using contraceptions, what supplements she was eating, and how her husband quit smoking. So the couples are very active in preparing to have a kid. So I asked her, why, and assess her ideal timing. She said, I don't plan on being DINKs, 丁克, a shorthand, an acronym for double income, no kids. So I don't plan on being DINK. So sooner or later, I'd have to have one. I'm really afraid though. So you ask me, what's the ideal time to have a child? There is no ideal time. The ideal time is when I couldn't possibly delay anymore. Seeing how my female colleagues are after having children, I'm truly terrified. They changed so much. They have their children, but they don't have a self anymore. I'm so afraid that I'd end up like that. So here is the theme, what I call the breaking of individual self. So what having children means among female respondents. Female respondents across the board, across the 3 life course stages, viewed having children as this large transformative change that could completely upend their ideal of self. And to this end, the most frequent preconditions they mention for making them ready to have a child is having an established career. But unlike some of the rational choice flavored model would suggest, having established a career here has little to do with the financial security of financial resources that work is able to provide. Rather, the rationale for having an established career before having children is that having an established career is viewed as a way that is, or a channel to be able to have cultivated an identity and self that is autonomous from home. In other words, having children is viewed as the harbinger of the breaking of individual self, of no longer being yourself. As Anling's quote said, they have their children, but they don't have a self anymore. And the work, on the flip side, is viewed as a way that are able to keep this autonomous self intact. So being able to establish a career are viewed across the board as the most common precondition for having children, not because it's the financial resources or security it may provide, but rather having established a career is viewed as having cultivated this sense of self. But when we look at the meaning attached to children among men, or men's rationale and intentions for parenthood, we see a drastic different picture. When I asked Jie, a 32-year-old man who had been married for a while, and he was also without children, when I asked him, why do you want to have children? Why? I was met with a deep perplexity. And Jie said, what do you mean, why I'm going to have a child? It is a thing you do. It is a thing that everybody does. So again and again, we see there's a strong normative expectation of parenthood among men. But when dig a little deeper about what this normative expectation means and carries, I think the next quote summarizes it a bit more. Louis is a 31-year-old man married without children. I asked him, what does children mean to you? Why do you want to have children? Louis said, when you are married and together all the time, romantic love turns into a familiar bond. 爱情变成亲情, romantic love turns into a familiar bond. And with your familiar bonds, everything feels natural. And you produce a kid and bind the 2 people together. So what having children means among male respondents? It is something you should do. There is a strong normative expectation that this is something you should do. And they happily oblige. They happily go with the strong expectation, this normative expectation. Because among men, having children is viewed as turning the couplehood into a real family of one's own. So without children, this is only love. This is only, 爱情. This is not a real family. But by having children, a child turns the couplehood into a real family of one's own, 自己的家. So in this sense, this child also, this a child turns a couplehood into a real family, and this also closely links to images of an ideal man they project for themselves, someone who's able to provide for this family of one's own. So in this sense, the role of parents also slightly differ for women and men. And I'm happy to talk more about the role of parents and the parental expectation in Q&A as well. But here, for the difference between the making and the breaking of individual self, for men, parents carries expectation. It's expectation that is expected and it's normative and something, following the footstep. Whereas for women, having children, the expectation from parents are viewed or framed as parental pressure. And in other words, for women, having children means this transforming the upending of self, and also it becomes this obligation that they cannot opt out of. So you will see this idea about children being the breaking of individual self in women that intend to have children, but in women that do not intend to have children, but also among women who intend to have children. And often in those cases, having children is framed as this obligation that cannot be opted out of. So we see among women a greater desire to retreat from parenthood. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, to what extent then this desire can be realized given the institutional and cultural constraints, it's another question. But here we see this gendered ambivalence and the gendered desire to retreat from parenthood, which is completely absent among male respondents. For male respondents, children is viewed as the natural next step in the life course. It's viewed as this natural step in making progress. In making progressions, you come into your own by having a family. So in this sense, the pursuit of individualism is inherently gendered. What it means to be independent, autonomous, and lead a life of one's own is gendered. And the link between the pursuit of individualism and the retreat from parenthood is an inherently gendered link. So what might explain some of these gendered link, this gendered pursuit and the gendered link we see? On the micro level, care work is still women's work in contemporary China. As this quote illustrated, this is a 37-year-old mother with one daughter. She works in a very well-regarded public middle school as an head of the English department. And she's married to a man who works in a government agency. And she said, men's lives don't really change with children. It all falls onto the mother. Like when I take my daughter to their extracurricular activities on weekends, mostly you'll see other moms there with their children and one occasional dad. And this micro-level gendered expectation and gender dynamics need to be understood and placed within the meso context in contemporary China, particularly the meso context of how the labor market is organized, particularly after China's reform and marketization. Particularly, the role of work units, danwei, have weakened after the reform. In understage socialism, work units provided a wide range of public goods and provisions that subsumed some of this domestic labor at home. And this role has significantly weakened after marketization, and the labor has thus shifted back to the family, and the lion's share has shifted back to the women. So on the micro and the meso level, these are some of the explanations at work. But also, it is worthwhile to look at the macro level. So not only thinking about women in the family, but also thinking about women in the eye of the state. In the micro level, it is also worthwhile to consider how women as individuals are imagined in the eyes of the state. Earlier, I highlighted the goals for China's long-standing population policies are about, governing reproduction for the goals of production. It's subsumed women's bodies as these vehicles for achieving demographic goals. And here again, under the universal two-child policy, women are again seen as this reproductive force. And this is summarized by this quote from a respondent. When she was talking about universal two-child policy, she said the government doesn't see us as a human being, but as human resources. In other words, it is worthwhile to consider in state policies how women as individuals are seen. So in other words, in this sense, having children is viewed as this gendered, viewed as having this gendered impact on individual self. Having children, women are subsumed. By having children, women are subsumed into the family, given the micro level gender family dynamics. Women are also subsumed into the state population control programs and the agenda, because the state policies see reproduction as this goes for achieving reproduction. So perhaps we can understand the making and the breaking of self in this ways, that by having children, women are bound to the family, women are also bound to the state. So what are some of the theoretical implications? On the theoretical front, again, these kind of the findings, the make or break of individual self, calls for gendering the link between individualism and family change that we observe. But also on the policy front, again and again, it's important to recognize that demographic processes are fundamentally gendered processes. So it's not about spreadsheet demography, where we see a number and think about what it means for development. But behind the numbers are individuals, and reproductive rights and gender equity thus need to be put to the foreground in population policies. And we are in a world where low fertility are a problem that is not just limited to China. Across East Asian, Southern Europe, countries are having below replacement fertility rate. But it's important to think about why is low fertility a problem, and for whom is a problem, and when state put forward pro-natalist policies, how are individuals as individuals' autonomy and selfhood imagined in these policies? And to that extent, that disjuncture between how the state sees individuals and how individuals see themselves in having children may also help us to think about, why pro-natalist policies may not work or may not resonate on the individual level. So thank you all for listening to the talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Let's see. We want to thank Dr. Zhou for a really excellent talk, and if she's available to take questions, we would appreciate it if you could type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will read as many of her questions as we can within the time that is remaining. So I'm going to start with this question. Thank you so much for this illuminating talk, Professor Zhou. When conducting your interviews, did you accumulate any data about the use of abortion in fertility decisions, family planning? How is abortion viewed as a tactic of family planning in contemporary China?
Thank you so much for this question. And abortion is actually my next project. I was about to go back to China over the summer, but then COVID happened, so I wasn't able to do that. So my respondents are in the age range of 22 to 38. So a lot of them are never married. Some of them are dating, some of them are not. And those who are married either have one child or without children. So I can say something about their contraceptive use among the married couples. Nearly all married individuals, after they got married, if they're not so intent on I do not want to have children, particularly the men, nearly all stopped using contraceptive methods. So oftentimes among the married individuals, having children is viewed as, you're married, then because you're married, whenever you have having a child is okay. So for this data, for this batch of interviews, I didn't specifically focus on abortion, but I agree that abortion, the politics of abortion, are particularly important in understanding China's reproductive control in reproductive control over the years. But thank you for asking that, and thank you for that. For that also allows me to think more deeper about my next project.
The next question is, Dr. Zhou, thank you so much for the incredible presentation. Could you please mention why one of the criteria for the interviewees was having some kind of tertiary education?
Awesome. Thank you so much for this question. Excellent eagle-eyed catch on the tertiary education. It was for two reasons. One, I am part of the larger project. I'm particularly interested in highly educated women's work-family conflict and how they reconcile, highly educated individuals, how they reconcile work and family, and what it means to be a mother. To be a mother and to be a working mother, and all. So that's one reason. A second reason is that I intentionally also selected on tertiary education to get at some of the fertility intentions and rationales that are beyond financial insecurity or financial constraints. So the idea is that because class and education are so closely linked, I'm able to get at some of the individuals where, you know, the bare necessity of being able to raise a child are met. And then that allows me to think about how they think about money, how they think about the financial resources in perhaps different, more classed ways. So that's the second reason. And the third is sort of a more methodological reason for that is inherently this is still a small n study. So I want to capture individuals who are different in many ways, but also having some of the, if you would, variable hold constants or controlled. So I can make comparisons. You can imagine if we have 100 individuals who also differ in terms of class, in terms of rural-urban differences, in terms of gender, in terms of life course stages, then each cell becomes so small that it's hard to establish a reliable theme and findings. But thank you for catching this point. An excellent question. Thank you.
I have I don't know if I can read all of his questions. He seems to have two questions, but I'm trying to get everybody that I can. Here's a question. Did popular ideas of motherhood and its value change with the one-child policy, such as that prior to that, it was not so often considered a breaking of self? I can imagine, for instance, that the policy might have led to more women in the workplace and thus changing ideas about women's sense of value.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the question. And women's work is a whole nother can of worm in contemporary China. I'm just gonna go very briefly on. I have so many thoughts, and I'm gonna just try to organize my thoughts. But thank you for the thought-provoking question. So one-child policy is very interesting. Some of the health advocates and feminists, Susan Greenhalgh, when she was interviewing feminists and health advocates in China in the late 1990s, find some of them are very in favor of the one-child policy because they viewed, one-child policy by having this hard cap on how many children you could have, liberated women from domestic labor. Of course, those are very sort of class thinking, because when you're thinking about sort of also how draconian and abusive control are employed, especially on rural women, that becomes more complicated. And China, because of the socialist legacy, women's work and there was a history of incorporating women into wage work, and women's work carries a very distinct moral meaning. For my respondents, those are the women who grow up actually having seen their mothers and their friends' mother working. So for them, work is viewed as this choice that you have to make, and work is expected, and work is moral, and work is something that makes a good Chinese woman. So that becomes trickier when the state policy is relaxed. from one child to two child. For a lot of my respondents, they are very in favor of the one-child policy because under one-child policy, at least there's a stopping point. Employers knows you have a stopping point. Mothers-in-law knows you have a stopping point. Whereas under two-child policy, it seemed like the yardstick have been moved further down the line. So there are discussions about intensified labor market discrimination. There are talks about intensified familial pressure. So it all comes down to a very sort of, at the crux of it is very interesting. So again, how do these women see themselves? So I'm thinking sort of an overarching question that I've been thinking lately is that in some extent, this population control policy in individuals' fertility decision making gives me a window in trying to understand a broader sense of question. What does it mean to be a good Chinese woman in contemporary China? What does it mean for one to be independent, autonomous, and have rights in a space where one, the state have a considerable power over many things, and on the other hand, the patriarchal family have considerable power in many things. So individuals, family, and state, how do they align with each other? And where does work come into this? Where does economic power and economic independence come into this? The labor market, capital. So that's some of my my more sort of thoughts that are not broadly related to this. Thank you so much for this very thought-provoking question.
Now I have another question. This comes from Mary Gallagher. In the construction of your sample, did you avoid selecting respondents who already had 2 children? Do you worry that your sample is biased against people, men or women, who desire multiple children?
I did not select individuals who already have 2 children, but I didn't select on whether they intend to have a second child. Some of my, about one half, less than one half, not a third of the married and one child sample, both men and women, do intend to have a second child. And I'm still sort of wading through those interview data. A very, very interesting emergent theme that I've seen so far is for women, when they're talking about second child, it seemed that those are the women that have made, let me rephrase. So those are the women, so for example, those are the women who say, okay, my work, I see no mobility in my work. I might as well have another child. So it seemed that it's a choice or a trade-off that they also are intentionally making, but just that so that, you know, work, it is, their mobility at work is already blocked or sort of reached at this glass ceiling point. They might also turn to fulfillment inside family. So, but I agree that I need more sort of negative cases and comparison cases from those who already or who are intended to have more than one child and see how they sort of think about the things. But right now, from what I've seen from the data, it seemed that they fit into the overarching narrative about, you know, autonomy, the breaking, the making. It's just the women that are intend to have 2 child are the ones who, you know, who seeing work and as this at this space where there's no more to do, and then I turn to family rather than I try to do both. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, I'm going to read 2 short questions because time is, we don't have a lot of time left. One is, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if this study was published anywhere yet. Second one, this is terrific work. Do you think your results would change if you included those without tertiary education?
Thank you for both questions. So on the publication front, there are 2 papers already out from the project, one on working mothers and the meaning of wage work that just published in August, and another last year on sort of fertility intentions and one-child policy, one in Journal of Contemporary China, one in Journal of Social Issues. So kind of a plug for the 2 papers. And I'm writing a couple more right now that hopefully I can send them out. And yes, how do we think about individuals who are without tertiary education? How do we think about individuals who are rural women and men? I think fundamentally, it is also a question of, you know, what do we mean by constructing self. What does selfhood mean? Selfhood inherently is classed, is gendered, and is racialized when we think about it. So I have to say, I don't know what sort of construction of selfhood would look like among those without tertiary education, and among a wide range of social class spectrum. But within this sample, within this individuals that are urban, that have some education, and who has some level of some higher education, and who are mostly working women and working men, selfhood means having children has this gendered implications on selfhood. But I really appreciate this question, and it forced me to think more about sort of the selfhood in itself being a class and gender object.
Next question is, thanks for the talk. Could you elaborate on whether the decline in fertility varies across different demographic groups by education, class, urban, rural, divide, etc.? Would you expect the found gendered link and perception to vary by these groups?
Yes, I think this is as I sort of already thank you for the question. I think this again goes into the question of how do we think beyond urban families? How do we think beyond higher education level? Again, sort of the selfhood is inherently gendered and class. I'm not making claims about other social groups. In terms of fertility decline, in the huge demographic literature in Western industrial societies noted this twin trends. Fertility decline is often associated with women's rise in educational attainment and women's increasing engagement in labor market. And oftentimes, if you're looking at sort of demographic literature on Western societies, highly educated individuals are often viewed as the flag bearers, the forerunners of that group that driving fertility decline. If you look at patterns, you do see that there are class and educational differentials in total in fertility. And in the Chinese context, it's a little more interesting, or a little the nuanced part of it. The fertility population policy, the birth limits are reinforced in different ways across rural and urban. So it's a 1.5 child policy in rural areas where so we see those differences. But again, I think it's important for me to think more about the meaning of children and what it means to be a self in a broader spectrum. But my data at this point looks at highly educated urban individuals.
So I'm going to merge two questions into one, and I regret that due to lack of time, this will be the last we can do. We have two questions asking about low birth rate and how they could cause problems, or if they're being perceived as a problem. So the question is, to what extent do you feel as though the low birth rate is something that needs to be addressed through government policy at all?
Thank you for this question. I was just finishing up 2 weeks of lecture on low fertility in the courses I teach this year, and the question I ask I pose for my students is low fertility a problem? And if it's a problem for whom? Low fertility is framed as a problem as often from the nation state's perspective. That's assuming no immigration, that we want the population to reproduce itself. So it carries a lot of assumptions there. But on the micro level, why low fertility is a problem? I would say it's, if you look at survey data, you would see that across the board, in many countries, that individuals still have a two-child ideal, meaning that two-child is viewed as the ideal family size, and they're not reaching that. So on the micro level, perhaps there's this idea of unmet desire. So there must be some obstacles and constraints that are keeping individuals from achieving their ideals. And in that sense, low fertility is a problem for individuals. But on the grand scheme of things, it is inherently interesting to think who is problematizing low fertility and is problematizing as a whom. So I'm not making any moral and normative claim about the problem of low fertility, but rather this is a story about, how do individuals, on the ground on the micro level think about what does having children mean and what and why it matters, and by attaching that meaning that goes into their imagination for the future and construction of who they are. But thank you for the excellent question.
I want to thank Dr. Zhou for her excellent talk. And I regret we have to end because we're now after 1 o'clock, and hope that you will all join us next week for a talk by Wen Yu. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhou.
We have the after talk from 1 to 1:30. If there are additional questions you would like, please come join the after talk session. If you cannot, I hope to talk to you all soon. And thank you again for coming. I know this has been a challenging semester and challenging weeks. Thank you all.
Thank you.